The name Horseshoe Bend echoes through the annals of American history. For most, it conjures images of Andrew Jackson and the Creek War of 1814 in Alabama, a monumental battle that broke the power of a native nation and forged a future president. But 18 years later, and 1,000 miles to the northwest, another battle was fought at another Horseshoe Bend. It was a desperate, bloody affair, a brief, brutal skirmish on the banks of the Pecatonica River in the summer of 1832. Though it involved fewer than 50 men, this forgotten conflict would become the definitive turning point in one of America's most tragic frontier wars. It was a fight born of terror, fueled by vengeance, and its outcome would seal the fate of thousands. This is the story of that other Horseshoe Bend, the battle that restored a nation's confidence and unleashed a final, terrible wave of destruction. June 1832. The lead mining region of the Michigan Territory, what is now southwestern Wisconsin, was a place of raw opportunity and palpable fear. For a month, the frontier had been convulsed by the conflict known as the Black Hawk War. Settlers huddled in hastily built forts, while the territorial militia, a loose collection of miners and farmers, patrolled the vast, unnerving wilderness. On June 14th, 6 men cautiously ventured out from the relative safety of Fort Hamilton. Their destination was the nearby farm of Omri Spafford, one of the first claims in the county. The men, Spafford, his partner Francis Spencer, a 17-year-old named Bennett Million, Abraham Searles, James McIlwain, and an Englishman known only as John Bull Compton, were there to work the fields, a necessary risk in a land where starvation was as great a threat as war. They had only just begun their labor when the prairie erupted. From the cover of the woods, a war party of Kickapoo warriors, loosely allied with the Sauk leader Black Hawk, unleashed a surprise volley of musket fire. The settlers dropped their tools and ran for their lives, sprinting toward the one landmark that promised escape, the Pecatonica River. They plunged into the water and made a desperate crossing, but as they clawed their way up the opposite bank, exposed and exhausted, the Kickapoo warriors took aim. 4 of the 6 men were cut down. Omri Spafford, Abraham Searles, James McIlwain, and John Compton were killed instantly. Only Francis Spencer and young Bennett Million managed to escape into the brush, leaving a scene of carnage behind them. When a volunteer force finally reached the site, the horror of the attack was fully revealed. The bodies of the fallen were badly mutilated. Omri Spafford's corpse was headless. His head, scalped, was found discarded in the tall grass nearby. The Spafford Farm massacre was not just another casualty of war. It was a visceral nightmare that sent a shockwave of terror through the mining settlements. It was the spark that would ignite a firestorm of retribution. The abstract fear of war had become a tangible, local reality, a direct consequence of a power vacuum on the frontier created by a spectacular American failure 1 month earlier. To understand the panic that gripped the frontier in June, one must look back to May 14th and the war's disastrous opening act. Near the Kishwaukee River, a detachment of 275 Illinois militiamen under the command of Major Isaiah Stillman had located Black Hawk's band. They were a boisterous, undisciplined force, described by one contemporary as uncouth men who produced prodigious quantities of both hot air and whiskey. They had come for a fight, anticipating an easy victory. Black Hawk, however, sought to avoid one. Finding himself without the British or tribal allies he had been promised, he sent 3 warriors under a white flag of parley to negotiate a truce. But the skittish and poorly led militiamen saw only treachery. When they spotted other Sauk scouts observing from a nearby hill, they opened fire on the peace delegation, killing one of the emissaries. The response was swift and shocking. Enraged by the violation of the truce, Black Hawk led a small party of warriors in a furious counterattack. The effect on the Illinois militia was instantaneous and catastrophic. The entire detachment of 275 men broke and fled, in what was later named, with considerable accuracy, as Stillman's Run. The rout was so complete that Major Stillman was said to have outrun most of his own men. 12 militiamen were killed in the panicked retreat. The defeat was more than a military blunder. It was a profound psychological blow. It shattered the settlers' deeply held belief in their own martial superiority, replacing it with a paralyzing fear. The power dynamic on the frontier had been violently inverted. The news of the rout spread panic all over frontier Illinois, triggering mass desertions from the militia. Governor Reynolds' entire volunteer army had to be disbanded and reorganized. Among those who remained to bury the dead was a young militia captain from New Salem, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. The humiliation at Stillman's Run created the terror that would fester for the next month, setting the stage for the bloodshed at Spafford Farm. The war itself was born from a deep and irreconcilable conflict over land and legacy. At its heart was the controversial Treaty of St. Louis, signed in 1804. The treaty ceded millions of acres of Sauk and Meskwaki territory, including their ancestral village of Saukenuk, in exchange for a paltry annuity. Most tribal leaders, including the warrior Black Hawk, considered the treaty fraudulent, signed by men who had no authority to sell their nation's birthright. For years, a tense peace held. But the lead rush of the 1920s brought a flood of American settlers who disregarded native claims, burning homes and destroying crops. The Sauk were forced to cross the Mississippi into Iowa, where they faced a harsh winter with inadequate supplies. In April 1832, the 65-year-old Black Hawk made a fateful decision. He led his British band, a group of about 1,000 people, less than half of them warriors, back into Illinois. His intentions were complex and ultimately tragic. He was not seeking war, but a return to his homeland to plant corn, hoping to find support from other tribes and the British, allies who would never materialize. It was a desperate gamble, born from a clash between the American government's policy of Indian removal, championed by President Andrew Jackson, and a traditionalist leader's refusal to abandon the sacred land of his ancestors. This miscalculation would plunge the Illinois frontier into a war that neither side was truly prepared for. Out of the chaos and incompetence that defined the early weeks of the war, one figure began to emerge: Colonel Henry Dodge. He was the antithesis of the failed leadership at Stillman's Run. A veteran of the War of 1812 and a seasoned frontier commander, Dodge was a man forged by the very environment he was now tasked with defending. In 1827, he had moved his family to the lead region, establishing a mining and smelting operation that became the core of a new community. He was not an outsider or a political appointee. He was a leader whose authority came from the respect of his neighbors. As commander of the Michigan Territory's Iowa County Militia, his troops were not part-time soldiers far from home. They were the rough-and-ready miners of the region, men defending their own claims, their own property, and their own families. Their motivation was immediate and deeply personal, creating a cohesive and determined fighting force that stood in contrast to the demoralized Illinois volunteers. Just days before the Spafford Farm massacre, the U.S. Army's overall commander, General Henry Atkinson, had given Dodge broad authority to quell the violence in the mining district. When the news of the slaughter arrived, he was ready to act with a speed and decisiveness the war had not yet seen. Dodge's reaction to the massacre was immediate and furious. He rode at once to Fort Hamilton, where he quickly assembled a company of 29 mounted volunteers. There would be no hesitation, no waiting for orders from a distant general. Vengeance would be swift. He led the chase himself, plunging through tangled underbrush and across open prairie until the raiding party was spotted in the distance. The Kickapoo warriors, realizing they were being pursued by a determined force, made for the Pecatonica River. They crossed it and disappeared into a dense, overgrown swamp on the other side, taking refuge in a winding oxbow of the river, a natural fortress they believed would be their salvation. It would instead become their tomb. The contrast between the war's first engagement and the one that was about to unfold could not have been more dramatic. At Stillman's Run, a large, undisciplined force was routed by a handful of warriors. Now, a small, well-led posse was closing in, determined to reverse that humiliating outcome. The stakes of the chase became intensely personal just moments before it began. On his ride to Fort Hamilton to gather his volunteers, Dodge and his escort had made a last-minute decision to take a detour off the main road. Shortly after, they passed a German immigrant named Henry Apple. Moments later, they heard the crack of muskets. Apple had walked directly into an ambush set by the same Kickapoo war party, an ambush almost certainly intended for Colonel Dodge himself. Apple was killed. His wounded horse, riderless and frantic, galloped past the soldiers and all the way to Fort Hamilton, its bloody saddle raising the alarm. For Dodge, the pursuit was no longer just a military operation to avenge the victims at Spafford Farm. The enemy had tried to kill him. They had murdered a civilian he had spoken to only moments before. It was now a personal vendetta, fueling a resolve that would accept nothing less than the complete annihilation of the enemy. Dodge and his 29 men tracked the Kickapoo to the Horseshoe Bend on the Pecatonica. The 11 warriors had chosen their ground well. They were concealed on a high bank, hidden in the dense foliage, using the terrain as a natural breastwork. A mounted charge into the swamp would be suicidal. In this crucial moment, Dodge made a series of brilliant tactical decisions. He ordered his men to dismount, leveling the playing field and turning the engagement into a contest of infantry. He then offered his volunteers a chance to withdraw from the perilous assault. None did. This was not a sign of weakness, but a masterstroke of leadership. It forced each man to consciously commit to the fight, forging them into a single, determined unit. Leaving 8 men to guard the horses, Dodge prepared to lead the remaining 21 into the swamp on foot. They moved forward in an extended line, muskets at the ready, unsure of the enemy's exact location. For 200 yards, there was only an unnerving silence. Then, with a deafening war cry, the Kickapoo unleashed their volley. The blast was devastating. 3 of Dodge's men were hit: Samuel Black, Samuel Wells, and Monteville Morris. In a single moment, nearly 15% of the attacking force was down. This was the moment of truth, the point where the militia at Stillman's Run had panicked and fled. But Dodge did not hesitate. Before the shock of the volley could set in, he roared the order to charge. His men obeyed instantly. They rushed forward, closing the distance before the Kickapoo could reload their single-shot muskets. Dodge's decisive action exploited the critical weakness of muzzle-loading firearms, turning the Kickapoo's strong defensive position into a death trap. The fight descended into a bloody hand-to-hand melee. It was a whirlwind of violence, fought with bayonets, tomahawks, and clubbed rifles. The entire battle, from the first volley to the last death, lasted only a few minutes. When the smoke cleared, the victory was absolute. All 11 Kickapoo warriors lay dead. Not a single one had escaped. Dodge's losses were 3 killed and 1 wounded. In the immediate aftermath, Dodge's men engaged in the brutal calculus of frontier warfare. They scalped the dead. About an hour later, another militia company arrived, accompanied by allied Menominee, Sioux, and Ho-Chunk warriors who had been recruited by the Americans. Colonel Dodge reported that he gave some of the scalps to his native allies, who were delighted. They then proceeded to further mutilate the corpses of the fallen Kickapoo. This grim scene reveals the complex, multi-sided nature of the war. It was not a simple conflict of whites versus natives. The United States actively exploited long-standing intertribal rivalries, turning the war into a civil conflict between native peoples as much as a fight against American expansion. The shared, violent ritual of the aftermath blurred the lines between civilized and savage warfare, revealing a common language of brutality on the American frontier. Militarily, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend was a minor skirmish, but its psychological impact was immense. It is consistently described by historians as the war's great turning point. After the national embarrassment of Stillman's Run, this was the first real American victory in the war. The victory's significance was symbolic and narrative. It provided the American side with a new story to tell, a story of heroic vengeance and competence that overwrote the previous narrative of cowardice and failure. Dodge's men had proven that the militia could obey orders, stand firm under fire, and utterly defeat their enemy. News of the victory helped restore public confidence in the volunteer force, changing the entire psychology of the war. It gave settlers and soldiers the belief that they could win, a necessary precondition for the final brutal campaigns to come. With morale restored and Colonel Dodge now a rising star of the conflict, the hunt for Black Hawk's main band began in earnest. Dodge and his miners would form the vanguard of General Atkinson's main army, relentlessly pursuing the increasingly desperate and starving Sauk and Meskwaki across the swamps of southern Wisconsin. The brutal efficiency demonstrated at Horseshoe Bend became the tactical model for the rest of the war. The no-quarter mindset, validated by Dodge's success, would have devastating consequences. The pursuit ended on August 2nd at the mouth of the Bad Axe River. It was not a battle, but a massacre. Caught between the river and the American army, Black Hawk's people, including hundreds of women and children, attempted to surrender. Their white flags were ignored. For 8 hours, soldiers on the bank and cannon from the steamboat Warrior slaughtered the cornered people as they tried to swim to safety. Of roughly 1,200 people who had followed Black Hawk into Illinois 4 months earlier, only about 150 survived the war. The lesson of total, merciless aggression, proven effective in the small, bloody skirmish at Horseshoe Bend, was now applied on a horrific scale, bringing the war to its genocidal conclusion. The Black Hawk War effectively ended major native resistance in the Old Northwest. By 1837, the remaining tribes had been forced west of the Mississippi, opening the land for a flood of American settlement. The year after the war, the city of Chicago was incorporated. Dodge's reputation soared. He became a national hero, went on to command the 1st Regiment of U.S. Dragoons, and was appointed the first governor of the Wisconsin Territory. Black Hawk surrendered and was imprisoned. He later dictated his autobiography, an eloquent and defiant defense of his people's actions. Today, the battlefield is a quiet county park. A monument, erected in 1922 by the Daughters of the American Revolution, commemorates the fight. Its inscription ends with a line that captures the perspective of the victors. "Thus was our land made safe for settlement." But at some point, someone came to this quiet place and with a simple act of vandalism, challenged that triumphant narrative. By striking out a single word, they transformed a declaration of ownership into a stark, ambiguous statement. The legacy of Horseshoe Bend is one of contested memory. For some, it was a heroic struggle that secured a homeland. For others, a brutal episode in a long, tragic story of dispossession. Here, in this peaceful park, marked by a stone monument and its defiant scar, those two irreconcilable histories remain, locked in a silent, unending conflict.